This discussion this evening is one between Matthieu Ricard and Jane Goodall, both of whom have a same message to send, which is that we are not to be conceived as separate from the worlds we inhabit, that we are deeply interdependent and social beings, not only in our relationships to humans, but also in our relationship to the natural world and to other sentient beings, animals. In order to launch the discussion, I would propose that we start, however, from the first level, that of the individual, and his or her relationships to other human beings. The question I would like to ask is the following. We have been taught since many years, perhaps since 2 or 3 centuries, that the nature of human beings is to be maximizers of utility, to be selfish, to see others as obstacles to the fulfillment of one's life plans, and to see the world, therefore, that we inhabit, that we share with others, as a world in which the battle is permanent as a condition for survival. This is the language we've heard from utilitarianism. It's a language we hear from economists. It is a language on which much social science is premised. It is a language that, however, we believe is deeply misleading, given the cooperative nature of the species and the fact that we actually have managed to overcome the obstacles to evolution, not despite the others, but thanks to our cooperation with others. And this is the reason why Matthieu Ricard, for example, insists on the need to move away from self-centeredness and selfishness towards selflessness, and to develop a relationship with others which is based on a very different understanding of human nature. But the question is, can we escape this story that is told to us? Is it needed today to unlearn what we've been taught about whom we are? To which extent is the struggle that you lead, Jane, Matthieu, dependent on us re-civilizing ourselves? So in other terms, what is the role of our own spiritual change in better relating to others and better relating to the outside world? I'm not sure which one of you would like to start. Please.
I would like to hear Jane first.
Jane, please.
All right, well, let me start off by saying that, of course, all that you've just said is nothing to do with the way I was brought up and taught. It's completely different. And I could even go a stage back. Let's think about us as individuals. We are absolutely interdependent within our bodies. We have hearts and livers and muscles, and we don't even think about it very much, but they're all totally independent on each other, and we are totally independent on them. So we start off with a reliance on the interdependence of our own selves. And certainly, at least if one grows up in a normal family, the family unit is dependent, interdependent. If you have a typical, the typical family, the man is the breadwinner, the woman is today a breadwinner too, the children are dependent on the parents. And I think I was brought up mostly during World War II, and we all had to pull together. There had to be an independence and an interdependence on the people that you were fighting with, for example, if you were in the army. And then this whole idea of the selfishness, it really kind of came out with the selfish gene and Richard Dawkins, and suddenly biologists and students were being taught this theory that you've just propounded. It's relatively new, I think, and certainly if we go back to our prehistoric ancestors, the the clan, the little clan, those members were absolutely interdependent on each other in order to survive against other clans, and an individual by him or herself wouldn't stand much chance. So, I mean, it's really fascinating. What you bring out is a theory that was proposed, which took off, which took fire. Lots of scientists followed it, but to me, it was always complete nonsense.
Absolutely, but it still seems to me to be a very dominant narrative that only is put between parentheses at certain specific moments. For example, when a nation is at war, you mentioned Second World War, and we have to, stick together. But for the most part, what we hear is we are meant to be fighters, we are meant to be competitive, we are meant to see others as people against whom we have to compete. And this is exactly the recipe for being unhappy, isn't it, Matthieu?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with Jane, because myself, I was taken completely by surprise when I did research for this altruism book. Because first I've been raised with wonderful, kind parents, and then I went in a culture where compassion is just the heart of everything we do. I mean, when I went in retreat once, I was here in Belgium, and I said to the Dalai Lama, I'm going to go for a few months in retreat. What will be your instruction? He said, in the beginning, meditate on compassion. In the middle, meditate on compassion. In the end, meditate on compassion. So when I did the research, I thought, well, there may be people who don't think like that. Who are they? And I was actually surprised to find, yes, there is a core, philosopher like Hobbes or a few others that do think they are very, very smart. And psychologists, first half of the 20th century, they say, well, everyone knows that we are motivated basically by selfish motives, full stop. And then people like Freud didn't help. He said, I've asked very little myself about the deep nature of human beings. From what I know, most of them are rascals. So that's a statement. And then you have a philosopher like Ayn Rand said, from my perspective, altruism is immoral. Okay. But if you really look at science, first of all, the whole history of humanity is not like that. History of evolution is not like that. And then even if you look at the social science, it's armchair science. There's not a single well-done psychological, sociological study that shows that people systematically act in selfish way. Just the opposite. But all the good science about altruism has shown that no matter what, even you give an easy escape, even you put people in a way that they could just not do anything, many of them will just do it as the main motivation is to help someone out of suffering or something without any ulterior motives. And people like Daniel Batson have spent 30 years putting people in very complex situations and showing that invariably there's a number of people who will behave in an altruistic way. So this idea is just never been based on solid science. And then if you look at evolution, of course competition is there. We know that. There's no need to write a book to prove that selfishness exists. Of course selfishness does exist. But to say there's nothing but selfishness is such a silly idea. I agree that classical economics has said that. Francis Edgeworth, one of the founders of modern economics, said there's no place for altruism in economic system, full stop. And the definition of homo economicus is maximizing personal preferences and interest. But it's a completely reductionist view of human beings. So that doesn't correspond to what we are. So what is amazing is this idea could stand at least for a few decades without seeing that it flies in the face of reality.
Is it changing? We now have more and more studies on the need to reclaim the commons and the need for collective action for the maintenance of the ecosystems, the need for collaborative institutions to be put in place. I think the work of Elinor Ostrom, with all its ambiguities, because it still is very much premised on this view of utilitarianism that we've described, has done a lot to promote this idea. So do you think it's changing? Do you think we are now moving beyond this idea that has been with us, I thought, for centuries, maybe it's for some decades, but this idea that we are deeply programmed in our DNA to be competitive. Do you think it's changing? It's successfully being challenged today.
Well, Jane was alluding to selfish gene. Genes are no more selfish than the shoes or something. Genes don't have motives. So what are you talking about, So things like that. I mean, people think a little bit,
But let's take it back to the chimpanzee, which I know so well. And really learning about the chimpanzee has shaped a lot of the way I think about us. And if we take, and I go back to Richard Dawkins, because to me it was a real shock when this new science came into being, and I struggled to try and understand it. And so I went to the chimpanzee. Is it true that the chimpanzees have selfish genes? Is it only about doing things so that I will prosper, so that I will have probably more children? Is this the way the world works? And if you think about evolution, it should then mean that in chimpanzee society, they're selfish. And actually, it's not true. They depend on each other in their communities. And they're very territorial, and a community will come together, particularly the males of a community, they get together, and it's only when they cooperate, it's only when they get together that they can protect their territory with its resources for their own females and young. And so right from the very, the underpinning in evolutionary theory, we come from a species or, a similar ape-like, human-like creature, which presumably behaved fairly like chimpanzees or gorillas, and they all rely on cooperation.
Matthieu, could you tell us...
Just to give an example, people who volunteer to work and clean Fukushima, selfish genes should tell them to run millions of miles away. Why should people do anything for the good of others if they're only selfish gene at work?
Matthieu, could you tell us something about how working across different cultures allows you to put in perspective the narratives about whom we are and the kind of values by which we are shaped? You told us a minute ago that when you first went to a retreat in a monastery in Nepal, I believe it was 1972 or 74? 67, I'm sorry. That you were struck by the fact that compassion was everywhere. And should we see this lack of understanding of altruism as a sort of happiness as a result of the domination of the Western way of looking at us and looking at the world? Is it something that is in fact a form of ethnocentrism?
I think we were talking with Jane, we had a nice time before we came to join you, and I mentioned the term banality of goodness, and Jane rightly said is the reality of goodness. Is most of the time, most of 7 billion beings behave decently with each other. That's reality. And why we are shocked when it's not the case? Because it's a deviance. And that's why there's a kind of natural, I think evolution equipped us to pay attention to something that's potentially bizarre, dangerous, threatening, abnormal. So that's why there is an unconscious propensity to report on that, to be shocked by that. Violence has declined steadily over 5 centuries. Which journalists say that every day on the radio? The homicide has gone down 100 times in Europe since 14th century. 100 times. We don't say that.
Stephen,
so this, a young person, at 20 years old in Europe, has seen 40,000 violent deaths on TV or film. What does that mean about reality? This is ridiculous, no? So this distortion leads to the wicked world syndrome. But it's not what reality is about. It's about cooperation. If 100 people cooperate to help chimpanzees or elderlies, nobody will be on the evening news. If one of them attacks an old lady or rob a bank, you will be on the evening news.
There was a study, I think it was in Finland, I'm not entirely sure it was Finland, maybe it was Sweden, but Scandinavian country, in which it was shown how people changed their views of the world once the media stopped reporting about petty crimes and reported about positive stories. So this demonstrates is very much a cultural artifact, how we perceive each other and how we relate to one another. Let me now turn...
Jane has something she's starting about good news, which is much needed.
Yes,
Tell you about that.
Jane Goodall's All Good News. Because,
Indeed.
because you know, we really, there's so much goodness around us. There are so many people. Just walk through a city and look around you and talk to people, and you find that most people are basically decent human beings. Now, of course, if we really want to talk about cutthroat selfishness and living in order to improve the moment for yourself, we get onto corporations, big business. There you sometimes get real cutthroat competition. But even there, within the business, there must be cooperation, or else they won't succeed.
Within the firm, but also there are many studies now that show that social capital within the community, which is trust, social norms, networks in which people support each other, are very essential to economic success. And we have many stories of regions, cities that have managed to surmount obstacles thanks to the fact that even within the business community, businesses cooperated with one another. But let us close this parenthesis and move to what is really the heart of this symposium on interdependence, which is our relationship to the natural world and to other sentient beings. I would like to perhaps start by asking the question of how different cultures relate differently to nature. In the Francophone world, one book that was quite useful in drawing our attention to how provincial the Western view that we had to dominate nature and use it for our purposes was the book by Philippe Descola, Par-delà nature et culture, published in 2005, that showed how different civilizations had a very different relationship to nature. And how, whereas in the Western world, nature is some resources we have to capture, to process for our own benefit, or a huge dumping site on which we can dump our waste, in other cultures, we work with nature. And nature is not an enemy to be domesticated and to be controlled and mastered. It is an ally with whom we have to build a partnership. And I would like, perhaps, Jane, first, I would like you to comment on how you've seen, across different cultures, different ways through which people relate to nature, and how, again, how provincial the Western relationship to nature, to be possessed and controlled is. Perhaps you could say something about this.
Well, I think the cultures I've seen where there is a deep respect and understanding of nature are the indigenous peoples. So that if you spend a bit of time with, for example, the pygmies in different parts of Africa, the Bushmen, I haven't spent much time with them, but I've read a lot about them and I've met some of them. If you spend time with the Native Americans or First Nation people, and that I have done, their entire culture is dependent on a relationship with nature. They don't make the distinction between us and animals. You know, there's the furred ones and the feathered ones, the four-footed ones and the two-footed ones. And so, of course, as they become more integrated into Western society or whatever society, wherever they are, does tend to change. They do get more selfish in relationship to the natural world. But, you know, the whole effort that we have to try and do today is to get back to that understanding of our dependency on nature and the natural world. It's the fact that we're dependent on it. And to me, having grown up loving animals, having grown up with dogs, watching birds, spending as much time in nature as I possibly could, spending hours up my favorite tree to be close to the birds and the wind and everything, it was a huge shock, having spent time with the chimpanzees, having learned about their amazing, complex society, to go to Cambridge University in 61, and be told by the erudite professors, of whom I was nervous, because I didn't have a degree at the time, that there was a difference of kind between us and the rest of the animal kingdom, that I shouldn't talk about the chimpanzees as having personalities, only humans had, but they told me that. I couldn't talk about them having minds capable of something like thinking. That was unique to us, and absolutely the most cardinal anthropomorphic sin was to talk about them having emotions like happiness, sadness, and fear. And I mean, to me, it was a complete shock. And you know how I could withstand them? Because I had this amazing teacher when I was a child who taught me the professors were wrong, even though they had more scientific know-how than I did. And that was my dog, Rusty. You can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog or a cat or a rabbit or a rat or a pig and not know that the professors were totally, completely wrong.
So, Matthieu, what can other cultures teach us about our relationship to nature and how wrong it is? How could you describe this?
No, even without talking of culture, but if you know a little bit about evolution, the idea that emotions, love, empathy would just come out of the blue suddenly in human beings without millions of years of preparation, that is so inconceivably, ignorant, because you cannot find any quantum leap at any time. Or people say, oh, I'm not a chimpanzee, but whatever as a common ancestor be, there have been so many tiny changes among the 30 or so species of hominids. Where do you find a quantum leap? Nowhere, anywhere in nature. So if you look at I think what's very interesting when I did also a little research about the animal book, is when our relations changed. Basically, hunter-gatherers and indigenous people, they think animals as different, sometimes even superior, because if you get to be eaten by a jaguar, you don't boast about the superiority of man about beast. You better run away and protect yourself and your children. But the idea that they honor the spirit of the jaguar, they respect them, they sometimes fear, sometimes admiration, and so this is very different, integrated in nature. I think the real thing happened when the sedentarization and then rising livestock. Why? Because, the animals they were hunting, they didn't know them personally. They respected the species, they knew how they work, they knew their custom much better than anyone, but they didn't have a personal relation. Now you start having those domestic animals that you call them names, and you become familiar. They have emotions, of course, and then one day you have to just kill them like that. So there's a huge, dissonance between you have been caring for them and suddenly you have to treat them like anything at your disposal. So they had to find some kind of justification. So they found thousands of justifications. God puts them just like that for us, so they don't have soul, or they don't feel anything, they don't suffer. Anything is good. Because you cannot live thinking you are a good person, but at the same time you do this again and again, kill something that you have been living with. So that dissociation started like that, and then the numbers of false excuses you can find is numberless, and up to Descartes, they're just machines and whatever. If you kick them, they're just like kicking a clock, so it makes noise. So things like that. Claude Bernard was told his student when he was stripping the animals of their skins and showing them, they say, hey, they don't feel anything, they just make noise. So it's not very long ago. So it's amazing the kind of ignorance that we can fall into.
And by the way, Darwin, he wrote a whole book on the emotions of animal and man. He knew.
So in a way, what you're saying, Matthieu, from your research, in particular that you find in Plaidoyer pour les animaux, is that we made this strong distinction between humans and animals in order to protect ourselves from this dissonance we felt.
We are a bad person.
So it was
in a way.
So when you speak of zoocide, it is also part of this, right? The industrialized slaughtering of animals is not imaginable if you take seriously that animals are sentient beings. So you need to
I'm sure Jane has much more to say, but just one thing. We did immense progress of civilization. I mean, 2-3 centuries ago, people, instead of going to see soccer matches, football matches, they were going to see people being tortured on the public arena with wife and children. Sunday afternoon, what would you go to see? People being hanged, being put on the wheel, and things like that. The last witch was burned in Switzerland in 1825, not very long ago. So now, of course, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, abolition of slavery, even though there are still many slaves, abolition of torture, at least illegal, at least. But this huge gap, human value has become valueless. You can't say, oh, human value is $10,000. Beyond that, we can kill the guy or something. But then when it comes to other species, if it has no commercial value, it's zero, basically. So this gap is so big. And I think it's a huge ethical inconsistency, incoherence in our times. So that's when I think the next challenge of our ethics is to bridge that gap. And so industrial farming, when I spoke about genocide, you can't believe what I heard in France. Wow, how you dare to make comparisons. I took every trouble to show the difference. It's a difference. Genocide is motivated by hatred. Animals is either indifference or greed. Genocide is to eliminate a population. Zoocide is to reproduce them again and again to kill them every year by millions and billions. So it's very different, but still it's a mass murder in a way. So
there's also, an incredible lack of logic in the way we think about all these things. I mean, you were talking about the onset of commercial industrialization of animals. So we breed them to eat, and now we put them in these torture houses. We put them in the intensive factory farms. And as you say, it's much easier to treat them the way they're treated if you think about them as mere things. But at the same time, those people may go home and they may have dogs or cats whom they love. It was like the Nazis in the concentration camps. They would be sweet and charming to horses and dogs, and then they'd go and torture human beings. But they would go home to their own families and love them. So there's a huge lack of logic in the way we think about all of these things. Christians used to be thrown to lions. People went and watched them in the arena. It was fun, it was sport, just as you say, like hanging by the neck till they're dead. You watch them kicking, you take your sandwiches and your children, and you enjoy it. And then, so we just don't have logic.
Well, part of
Melanie Joy wrote a book that's going to be in French soon. It says, we love dogs, eat pigs and wear cows.
Yeah.
So she gave the example of a wonderful dinner. The hostess brings some nice, delicious meat. And at the end, someone asked, can you give me the recipe? I said, well, I took my dogs and cut it into pieces. And what's the difference?
The people do eat dogs. In Korea, they eat dogs. In China, they eat dogs.
Not only they eat them, but they beat them to death because they think the flesh is better.
Yes.
So we will return to animals in a while, but let me broaden the perspective to nature beyond animals. And I would like you to comment on the emerging idea of ecological health that is coming up. The idea that our health, our well-being as humans, depends on relationship to nature. Not just that the ecosystems should not, fall apart as they might if things continue as they are bound to, it seems, but simply relating regularly to nature is a way to maintain physical and mental health, as shown by more and more studies concerning, for example, early child development. And I remember a blog that, for example, Matthieu, you wrote on the book of Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods, which describes how our children today have been removed from direct contact with nature. Most of their entertainment is electronic games and watching TV and screens. And they are therefore developing a number of pathologies that could be avoided by more frequent contacts with nature and the surprises that nature provides. And this is an idea that is more and more recognized, right? This idea of ecological health and the fact that the ecosystems must be maintained not simply because of the resources they provide and because we can't infinitely dump waste in the ecosystems, but also because we relate to the ecosystems in a way that helps us maintain our balance. And this perhaps is what indeed the indigenous peoples have to teach us. Would you like to comment on this?
Yes, well, it's certainly absolutely true. And as you say, there are more and more studies which show this to be true. In fact, Matthias and I were talking about that earlier. So early childhood, they have found that, I heard this yesterday, that there's a trend here in Brussels for playgrounds to be changed from being cement, asphalt, into green spaces. And what they've discovered, what they're discovering, is that the level of aggression goes right down. There's less fighting. So healthy psychological development, it's necessary to be out in nature for children. There was a woman who'd been, her child was killed and she was tortured and she escaped. She was from Rwanda. And she was traumatized so that she couldn't speak. She got to London, and the first thing they did was take her by herself into a garden, and they planted a rose, and they named the rose the name of her child, and as it slowly opened, she slowly began to open as well. Other traumatized people have been given paint, and as they draw a flower, at first it's a little bud, tight like this, but as they begin to have some psychological healing, the bud opens out. And, you know, these are just wonderful pictures. There was one last story. There was one woman, and she was Chinese, and she had a child, and the child was very, very underdeveloped, and so she took the child to a psychiatrist. And he asked questions about how she raised the child. And she said, well, I'm a maid, and I go around to the hotels, and I had my child in a cardboard box. And he said, well, if you have your child in a cardboard box, I mean, what do you expect? Of course it's going to have developmental problems. And she said, yes, but I was raised in a cardboard box. She was out in the rice paddy fields. She was in her cardboard box, looking up at the leaves, moving against the sky, the birds singing. The child in the hotel room was in a cardboard box. I mean, this is true. That is not invented.
No, there's a study done with patients in hospital, and patients who have a window on the park or something compared to patients who have just a window or nothing. And then there's much less painkillers needed, and a few days less of recovery. And same in jails, if you give them pet animals, much less violence, much more, less recourse to the... So biophilia is a fact, you know, we are attuned. There's a wonderful study showing pictures of different landscape to people all over the world. And even to Eskimos, the picture they like better is something with the green and water and little hill with a thicket of wood. The reason is water and greenery means abundance. The hills, protection, or you can watch, and you can hide in the forest. Even Eskimos would choose that, oh, that would be the nice place to live. So there's a natural attunement to that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And life expectancy is significantly enhanced by being in nature and seeing nature, as more and more studies show. I would like to both of you to say a few words about which are the arguments that you are generally presented or confronted with when you try to defend animal rights. We just tried to explain why it was important to see them as beings deserving of protection, to see them as sentient beings that deserve to be treated with respect and not simply as resources to be exploited. But I know that both of you are not simply writing books, but also advocating, entering into debates in which you are sometimes confronted with very strong opposition. Could you tell us something about the kind of arguments that you are opposed, and what is the most frequent misunderstanding or misconception or reaction that you get in your advocacy? Jane?
Well, it's mostly more and more of the same sort of thing, that there's so many suffering people,
Right.
that how can I justify raising money to look after mere animals? I mean, that's basically it. There are a few others, but that's the main one. And fortunately, I twist this around for a moment, if I may. I was flying over Gombe National Park, where I've done all my study. This was in 1991. And it was part of a forest that extended all the way along the lake and curled around. When I flew over in 91, the Gombe forest was a little oasis surrounded by completely bare hills, more people living there than the land could support. The forest cut down to try and grow grain to feed their families, terrible erosion. And that's when it dawned on me, there is absolutely no way we can even try to save these chimpanzees while people are living in this abject poverty. And it sort of brings the two together. So I can confront my arguers by saying we spend more money on trying to improve the lives of the people, and okay, underlying it is the hope that they will then help us to look after the wildness and the chimpanzees, which is true, they do.
Yeah, I heard, of course, the same arguments, but even some French philosopher, even more, I would say, how do you say, sort of righteous attitude saying, isn't it indecent to spend so much time considering what animals, when there is Syria, when there is Sudan, there is ISIS, and so forth. Sort of, oh, are you there? What does it have to do? First of all, there's this idea that if you care for animals, you care less for humans. Stupid. I mean, actually...
Because we're animals.
First we're animals, and second, most of the first people who actually thought of animal rights and so forth, they were also the first defender of human rights, the first defenders of men, women, gender equalities. Lamartine, the French poet, said, you don't have two hearts, one for humans and one for animals. You have a heart or you don't. So you see, in fact, if you shrink your benevolence, you say, I'm only going to love my kids, or I'm only going to love those who treat me well, or maybe my nation, or maybe my religion, because I have a limited, like it's a piece of cake, you can't give to everyone. But if you look at the sun, if the sun said, I'm only going to shine on a tiny bit of the population, it will shine less well, less light, less warm, so everybody's losing. If sun shines on everyone, then everybody is getting more. So actually, by loving all sentient beings, you love better your own children, you love better human beings, because the love is of better quality. Otherwise, you degrade this loving capacity.
And one little, this funny little twist here. Do you know that the first child who was, the first law, sorry, that when this man de Burgh, he wanted to do something about child cruelty. And the law that he used in court was the law that had been put in place to protect horses. That was the very first prosecution of cruelty to children, using the law that de Burgh had created to protect horses. I think it's just a lovely twist.
And then I'd like to add two examples. One is neuroscience. They put in an fMRI a group of people, 50 were vegetarians, just like that, and 50 were, not vegetarian. And then they show images of human suffering and animal suffering. Guess what? The vegetarian was much more sensitive to both, and the other one was less sensitive to both. So there's a kind of sensitivity. So maybe you'll say, oh, well, why are you blaming everyone? The other one is, the logic is so not solid. I was told look about Syria. What does it help the cause of Syrian refugee to kill 50 billion land animal and 1,000 billion sea animal every year? What does it help human rights in China? And then to stop harming, say, okay, I'm stopped to use animal as objects for my own, to live on the death and suffering of others. It takes 2 seconds. What does that prevent me from helping human beings? And by the way, both Jane and myself, we are devoting a lot of activities to human beings. Just to give the example of Karuna Sechen, last year we had 200,000 victims of the earthquake in Nepal. You know, so one question we could ask to those people who say, oh, it's indecent, what do you do for human beings yourself to start with, you know?
I think at an individual level, caring for animals results in an attitudinal change that can also result in being more benevolent towards humans. And as a species, if we were more sensitive to the sake of animals, we probably would be kinder to ourselves also. It would be a different philosophy of life, if you wish, that we would have. So I think this experiment that you said, that you described about vegetarians and omnivores being compared in their reactions to cruel treatment is a confirmation of what common sense should teach us.
It's not a blame game, it's just the fact that if you are more sensitive to others, suffering. And suffering is suffering no matter who suffers.
Yeah.
So if you have to name someone to become a university professor, the criteria is intelligence. If you get a knife stabbed in your stomach, whether you are a goat or human being, the suffering is basically the same.
So let me ask you, perhaps starting with Matthieu this time, on your views about farming animals. It's relatively easy to say we are against industrial livestock raising because of the very problematic environmental health consequences this leads to, the cruelty involved and so on. But what about the killing of animals which have been raised in decent conditions, as many indigenous communities do, in fact? Sometimes they do this following certain rituals, and they've given a name to these animals that they kill. Sorry?
What does that help? It's make their consciousness a little bit at peace. What does it help the animal? Who would the animal care about a ritual when you are going to kill the animal? So stupid.
So in other terms, your position is that
I mean, if you say someone, I treat you well for your life, now I have right to kill you. So this is speciesism.
The idea of there's this beautiful film we cannot not mention from Manu Kuman and Yvan Beck, Love Me Tender, that uses this fabulous expression of viande heureuse,
yeah, well,
which is animals who've been
happy
raised.
Meat. Please tell us about happy meat. Do you know any happy meat?
So animals raised in good conditions, who've been not put in these factory farms and so on, but ultimately indeed are killed.
Well, it's better that they are in the field, but why kill them in the end? What does that give any excuse?
There is some happy meat, you know. I think there is. Now, shall we have an argument over this?
Yes.
They are now growing very good chunks of, I think it's pork, maybe it's beef, and fish fillets in a Petri dish from a cell. It's apparently quite nice, and you can hardly tell the difference. We wouldn't worry about that, would we?
It's a bit expensive, I guess.
It's very expensive.
300,000 euros for 1 kilo.
But anyway, all I'm saying is that I
Yes.
completely agree. To kill the animal, to eat it when we don't need to eat it. That's the point. If we needed to eat the meat. But I mean, look at me. I'm 82. I'm still traveling 300 days a year. I give lectures and meetings, and you do much. You're not my age yet, and I told you you can't catch
71,
up
but
until
not
I'm
too bad
dead.
after 45 years of not eating meat.
So, and you know, we don't eat meat.
350 million Indians don't eat meat, and they seem
Yes,
to be doing pretty well.
absolutely. So we don't need to eat it. And if we have a lovely, happy animal in a field, I don't want to kill it. And you know, I think most people, most ordinary people, like we've talked about the number of people who are decent, if they had to actually go and kill the animal, most of them probably wouldn't.
And as everyone says, if slaughterhouse had glass walls, we will stop. You could not. But the thing is, you know, of course there are hunters or fishermen, Eskimos. No, but it's not. Of course there are, but this is a small minority today, which has a real necessity. Otherwise, everyone is losing. Everybody. The animals first. I gave the numbers, staggering numbers. That's equivalent of 6 million land animals per hour and 120 million sea animals per hour, every hour. Poverty in the world. About 700 million tons of grain shipped from South America to Africa to wealthy country to meat production. A reverse protein factory. You need 10 kilos of good vegetable protein to make 1 kilo of meat. So increasing poverty. They could feed a billion people. Good, bad for the environment. Now we know that. IPCC report, 15% of greenhouse gas effect comes from the whole chain of livestock. After the housing, before transportation. And then you get all those studies which have been synthesized by the WHO saying basically it's bad for human health. So who is winning in that story?
It's also the misuse of antibiotics. So that the Surgeon General in England 2 years ago, he said, the era of the antibiotic is almost over. Think what that's going to mean, and that's the overuse of antibiotic in intensive farming for the most part.
Absolutely.
70% of all antibiotics produced in the United States are to keep 70,000 poultry taken care by 10 people. They cannot care about individuals, so they spray, they just feed them with antibiotics. But of course, that's the consequences we know.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is absolutely true, and in fact, the estimate of 15% of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock farming is probably an underestimate. Most figures that I've seen are higher. Of course, there are different ways of counting, but if you count deforestation for pastures, if you count the use of maize and soybean to feed animals and all the land that is diverted from feeding humans, it is really a terrible.
Then I read an interesting survey in Australia. Why do you still eat meat? You think maybe health, blah blah blah, proteins? No, 78% because I like to taste. Yeah. Okay, is it any ethical arguments there? No. Then second thing is because it's tradition. And then because my family eats and I don't want to stop. Then I don't know what to cook. There's never any ethical argument. There's none. So see, it doesn't make sense.
No, absolutely. It's still true that in Belgium, for example, people have not been learning how to cook without meat, and a meal that is vegetarian is not well understood. I mean, people believe that it just means removing the meat from the plate, which is, of course, absurd. But it is part of the problem. It is deeply embedded in our culture that we believe a meal is not complete without meat. And I think it's probably one major obstacle for things to change. I would like to turn to a third level of our discussion, which concerns the relationship to future generations. And that interdependence. Basically, what we've been saying is that we need to understand animals much better because it's a way to relate much better to other humans too, and that being altruistic cannot be limited to the human species. But how does our concern for animals help us understand what we must do to support the future generation and to provide them with a world that is not entirely destroyed by our hubris? Jane, would you like to relate your fight for animal rights to future generations?
Well, it's not entirely limited to animal rights. It's about our destruction of the environment. The natural world is suffering very badly, and there's no way we can continue to destroy it the way we are and hope that my great-grandchildren will have a decent life. So I always come back to this, and I'm not sure who said this first, but we seem to have, as we have become more civilized, in quotes, we've lost a certain wisdom. And this is the wisdom of the indigenous people who made a decision only after considering how will this affect generations to come. It was the 7 generations, but it's not even one generation now. It's hardly our own children now. It's we're back to your beginning. How does the decision I make now affect me now? Or me and my family now? or the next shareholders meeting, that's typical, or the next political campaign. And so what seems to have happened, we differ from chimpanzees in several ways, but one is the explosive development of our intellect. So the chimp brain is almost the same as ours. They can do things which scientists never thought they could do, but you can't compare the brightest chimpanzee with a person who's designed a rocket that goes up to Mars and a little robot crawls off and takes photographs for scientists on Earth to see. Or the plane that's just circling, almost completely circling the world on solar power alone. And so what seems to have happened then is that there's been a disconnect between this incredibly clever brain and the human heart, love and compassion. And, you know, I truly believe that we only attain our true human potential when head and heart work in harmony. So going back to our children, we've got to get wisdom back. We've got to start making decisions, thinking about their future. And as we try and affect attitudes so that we stop destroying nature in that way, we also have to work with the children, hoping we can gradually get more and more of them to grow up thinking differently. So thinking in a new way, let's get a new culture. If people are going to say, well, we do this because it's cultural, then we need a new culture. Yeah. And we need a new culture of understanding and head and heart working in harmony, which is, you know, I'm traveling like this, really to grow our youth program, Roots and Shoots, which is in 140 countries, with about 100,000 active groups of all ages, trying to get a tipping point of young people who do understand that we need money to live, but we live for money at our peril.
So we've been making progress in science, in understanding the world, in developing technologies and so on, but we've forgotten this wisdom, and in fact we've been unlearning that wisdom that our predecessors still had. I think what's really interesting in the work of Matthieu Ricard is that he shows how the best science can actually come in the service of the most important spiritual messages. The usual way we are taught things is to say, well, we have scientists on the one hand and people of faith on the other hand, and that being deep spiritually is not the same thing as being a top-class scientist, as if these were two different views of the world. But your work on science shows that they are actually deeply connected, and that the best science shows that our values are wrong and that we must learn how to be wiser and not just good technicians.
I don't know exactly about faith, but I think for me, a real spirituality is another way of bridging the gap between reality and the way we perceive things in a distorted way. So science is about a genuine, rigorous investigation of reality, how things really are. And we come back to our theme of interdependence. The future generation is just taking the full measure of our interdependent nature. If we really understand that, then we cannot ignore future generation. It doesn't make any sense in terms of worldview. So in that sense, if you have a spirituality or a philosophy or a worldview that put interdependence at the heart of everything, that things don't exist on their own rights. They exist through, by true relation. They co-emerge because of many thousands of other causes and conditions. Look at a rainbow. Now, you would think when you see a beautiful rainbow, there's something intrinsically existent. The rainbow has a little bit of its own existence, but just mask the sun. And it's not a speck remains of the rainbow, not even a little bit. It only existed because of this interdependence of a curtain of rain, the sun shining in a particular angle, you being there. That interconnection made this beautiful rainbow appear. On its own, zero. It doesn't exist at all. So you understand that, and there's the continuum, and how can you be, thinking man extracted himself out of nature? How ridiculous. How can you extract? It's like saying I'm extracting myself out of my own body. You can't do that. So the future generation is simply is typical of the dilemma between altruism and selfishness. Because it's not quite easy to take care of people in front of you, you get this empathic response. But the biggest challenge is about people who don't exist yet, who will exist, will curse you because they say you knew and yet you did nothing. But my favorite Marxist is called Groucho Marx, and he said, why should I care for future generations? What did they do for me? But I heard Stephen Forbes, billionaire, saying on Fox News, that say, about the rising of the ocean, why should I care for something that will... he said, I find absurd to change my behavior now for something happening in 100 years. Speak about care for future generations. So if you do like that, there's no problem for the environment because we won't be there. So it's only if you deeply care, step by step, for other human beings, 8 million other species or co-citizens in this world, that you can... You see, it is a matter of altruism versus selfishness, the question of the environment. It's complex politically, economically, scientifically, but if you are selfish, there's no problem.
And if you're looking for little signals of hope here when we want to change attitudes, and you asking about spirituality and different religions, I see a lot of hope in the fact that some of the great religious leaders today are beginning to talk about the environment, and the Pope is one, the Green Patriarch is another, the Dalai Lama as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and the way they speak of this is by saying we shall not change our system and our civilization without changing ourselves. And the message they send is that we should begin by questioning the values by which we are motivated, what we represent ourselves as being progress, our image of happiness. All this has to be questioned in order for us to work on the environment. So it's a message that is very encouraging, I agree. Also very different from the message we get from most mainstream international agencies, for example, who promote green growth and see technology as the way to move towards a decoupled economic growth, for example. So I think this spiritual dimension of values, of how we measure progress, of how we define happiness, is exactly the kind of message that we are now hearing more and more from these spiritual leaders, perhaps a bit less from politicians for the moment. But I do think it's encouraging. Matthieu, you are smiling. You want to react to this?
Why not?
I think you're probably smiling because he mentioned genetically modified crops, aren't you? That's why I'm smiling.
Yeah, maybe. It's one of the many subjects where, you can have what we will call institutionalized selfishness, that you are causing suffering, but you only do it out of commercial interest. That's the only reason. So it's same for tobacco, it's same for harm sale, it's same for many things. And so that's really puzzling, that you're doing wrong, you still do it. So that's something that needs to be
That's back to
dismantled.
his original selfishness.
Well,
yeah.
I think part of the reason is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. I think we very often are persisting in certain attitudes, although we know they are damaging the environment, other human beings, animals, and future generations, but we feel our own choice will not make any difference, right? And we feel it's the system, and who is responsible for the system? No one, right? It's the paradox of the many hands, since many, many people would need to change their attitudes for my change to make a difference. It's not worth changing
I don't
oneself.
think so. That's maybe true for the clerk at Monsanto, but not about those who really have the reins of power in their hands. I mean, they know what they do. They do it knowingly. Climate change denial, tobacco industry, they know.
Yeah. So we shall now have to move to the public for questions. I would simply say that this last word of Matthieu shows how democratization of society, meaning the ability for each one of us to ask questions to those in power, to ask them what they're doing for the environment, for future generations, is absolutely key in order to
if the young
escape.
people of Roots and Shoots would vote, they would vote very differently.
Yeah.
We'll have very different leaders if they could, 16 years old could vote.
And one thing, to go back, we've already talked about the human intellect. And I have my various reasons for hope. And one I just learned last year when I was part of the climate march in New York, where the organizers expected 80,000 people. It was close to 400,000, and I was there and I saw everybody there. They were on their little electronic gadgets, you know, with their Facebooks. They were tweeting and twittering, and some of them were on their cell phones. So I heard some of them saying, you know, come and join us, because there's a lot of film stars out there. Leonardo DiCaprio's there. I actually heard one say, Jane Goodall's here. Yes.
Good. Let's go.
Anyway, so this was happening in major cities around the world. They say it was the biggest gathering of people around a single issue in the history of mankind. So that is a huge, empowering way of, you know, because people do think what I can do can't make any difference, it's just me. In fact, when millions of people do the same thing, it becomes a huge movement for change.
But given what, Jane, you said earlier concerning the short-termism of politics, the fact that they are, you know, focused on the next election and that we've lost the sight of the long term and so on, I know it's unfair to ask you this question, and you may decide not to answer, but do you think our political system as it is organized in our mature democracies are well equipped to deal with the kind of problems that you are concerned with? There are proposals from, for example, Dominique Bourg, who's a philosopher working a lot on ecology, to have an upper chamber representing future generations, right? His conviction is that we are so immature that we cannot trust the normal political system to think you know, beyond a very short timeline. And my question is unfair, but this is the question. Do you feel the political system is capable of delivering with, you know, 400,000 people working in New York on Climate Day? Or do you think we should really think of reforming institutions for us to be able to make a change in course?
Well, I think, you know, the first thing we would have to do in so many countries is root out corruption. Because while you have politicians in the hands of big business who are paying them hundreds of thousands of dollars to vote the right way, then nothing much is going to happen. So, you know, corruption is very obvious in some developing countries, but it's far more insidious and far worse in some of our democracies, or so-called democracies.
There's a study from Gillens and Page of 2014 showing how in the US Congress, for example, the preferences of citizens do not influence decisions. What does influence decisions are the preference of corporations. Yeah. And it's very distressing to see how the political system is indeed captured by these interests who do not have a heart, you see, and so the difference between their preferences and those of citizens is that they do not have emotions. They just calculate what, you know, the shareholder wishes.
We have one huge power, and that's the way we buy, not just the way we vote, what we buy.
So, Matthieu, on this point, and then we turn to the public, perhaps.
I think one of the, you know, politicians, they are tied up with the public opinion, how their ratings go up and down, that they are so eager to see what's going on. So I think one of the big revolutions of the 20th century was the civil society, the NGOs, millions of NGOs doing what the government is supposed to do. I mean, I feel a little bit embarrassed to say that in Nepal, after the 2 earthquakes, I mean, I hardly dare to say, we helped our small organization with a tiny group of friends 3 times more than the French government in terms of sheer funds that we brought to Nepal. It's absurd. You know, why should we, you know, get 3.5 million euros for the Nepalese population while the French government only give 1? So, civil population, I think people's power, the power of participative democracy, that's what should come, and that, I think that's the future.
Yeah, yeah. The most important restriction to power is not daring to use it. Someone said that once, and I think it's very true.
So if altruism, you know?
If people exercise their power, they would be able to have much more. Okay, so the turn is now yours to ask questions to Matthieu and Jane. please, on the third row here. There's a microphone traveling.
Do you think they could put some lights up so we
Yes,
can see
good idea. If we could have some more light in the public,
we are together.
because we then could see whom is speaking.
Yeah.
I remember the Dalai Lama, there was 20,000 people completely dark. He said, I'm in the impression that I speak to ghosts.
Please.
Better.
Is this working?
Is the mic working?
I'm not sure. Oh, okay, thanks. So I was saying I'm
No.
a teacher traveling.
You have to switch it on. It's on?
Okay.
Oh, good.
I'm traveling to listen to you speak from Sofia, Bulgaria. I'm a middle school science teacher. And
We can't hear very well.
I'm a science teacher visiting from Sofia, Bulgaria. And I've been educating my students about the work that you did, Jane, throughout your life and trying to promote them to follow their dreams and think that anything is possible. And so something that you mentioned to me stood out to them, and I'd like to go back to give them advice from you about how to motivate them as the next generation of leaders to make the best of their future and try to create a shift in society where we do begin to think again about the future and not just think about how things impact us as individuals, but how can they best change the world for their children and their children's children.
Well, no, it doesn't
You
work
have to wait
here.
a second until
Yeah.
the microphone.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Hears you.
I mean, all I can suggest, honestly, is that you try and get the Roots and Shoots program going, because it is changing hundreds of thousands of lives. And I think one of the reasons why it's so successful is that it's the young people themselves who choose the projects. They do projects to help people, to help other animals, and to help the environment. And they choose things they're passionate about. They choose things that are relevant in the society or the environment where they live. There's www.rootsandshoots.org. It gives you everything you could possibly need, how to start groups. And I truly think if you can get that going, it will start to make a difference, because it has everywhere.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Where? Okay, please.
Hello, I'm very thankful for this opportunity. I come from South America, and I see with deep in my heart and a lot of pain the devastation that is going on there. And when I try to convince politicians in South America, they always look forward to Europe. They say, but in Europe they drink milk, in Europe they take meat. And I don't know how to convince them to stop creating laws to protect the corporations. And how I do that when I see here in Belgium that they, you go to a Sotheby's, I don't know if you're familiar with that, or you are going to TEFAF and they sell our heritage. Or when you see the WWF, they train elephants to push elephants away to reservations. Or you see that the most rich and wealthy people hunt animals and kill elephants. It's very difficult because our countries seen up to Europe, but Europe, I'm sorry, but it's a very bad example.
Okay, so you gave some examples. They are not, of course, limited to South America. I've always been struck by how much there was this view of progress as imitation of the West, as if there was only one path towards development that would repeat our mistakes and end up in our impasse. And I think this is why part of the fight for the environment, for wildlife, for animals, is about multiculturalism and about recognizing the provincial nature of our civilization. And I think we we have a lot to learn from those civilizations that we've been conquering and colonizing. But it's very unfortunate that in many cases the elites in these countries see Europe as the mirage they want to mimic and the story they want to replicate. Latin America is not alone in this respect, certainly not. Matthieu, would you like to react to this or not?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's anything special with Europe, but it's the whole idea of even sustainable development is a little bit suspicious because you always think of development instead of quantitative growth, which is not possible, full stop. So if you speak of sustainable harmony, there's two things. For now, is reducing inequalities, poverty in the midst of plenty. This is not harmonious society. Sustainable harmony in the future is to live with nature without transgressing the planetary boundaries, protecting the environment instead of going to the 6 major extinctions is life going on Earth. If we lose 30% of all species by 2050, that's the way it's happening now. The world is doing completely different. It's not just the tigers of Sumatra or some rare species of frog. It's the complete, the planet would be completely different, including for human beings, by the way. So to realize that, I mean, this should really motivate us, and I think it does motivate the young people through Roots and Shoots and many other endeavors. But the clock is ticking. So which is going to come first? That's the big dilemma.
And also, what about the absurdity of this economic idea that you can have unlimited economic development on a planet of finite resources? And if everybody had the standard of living of the sort of average American or European, we'd need, well, it used to be 4 new planets. By now I suspect it's 5 or even 6. And we have only got 1. And, people saying, like you say, well, if it's in 100 years, I don't care. I only care about now. But we have to start thinking differently, don't we?
The message of Matthieu Ricard about reducing inequalities is very important, also because if we are in more equal societies, if we reduce inequalities, we will need much less development in the sense of growth in order to alleviate poverty. And if you have a very unequal society, you need lots of increased production and growth in order to alleviate the poverty and improve the sake of the poorest. So the fight for equality is deeply connected with the fight for the planet. And so what Matthieu said in this regard, I think, is extremely important. Yes, there's a question in the front here, second row. Pardon. The microphone is there, so we turn to you in a second.
Sorry,
Please.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I'm Belgian, coming from Rwanda, and my question is, what can we do to organize an event like the one you just had in New York about the climate change? So
we don't hear very well the people who speak in the microphone. You should really speak near the microphone.
Okay, so I will repeat the question. So my question is, what can we do to organize, or how can we organize the same kind of event you had in New York about the climate change? Is it something that we could organize here in Europe?
Why not?
Well, we have had climate marches. They were quite successful in their own way, despite the very strange atmosphere. You may remember this was just after the terrorist attacks on Paris, and many marches that were planned were disallowed as a result. But it's true that mobilizing people.
We had a project with the Jane Goodall Institute, 1 million people in the street, but no, with what happened, the drama that happened in Paris was not possible.
But mobilizing people is extremely difficult, and I think one reason why it is because very often we fail to practice what we preach and to apply in our own personal lives what we feel should be done for the planet. And I think this lack of consistency between what we do and what we say, for many people living normal lives, is really a source of a problem for the credibility of the messages that we send across. And I have to say that this is one reason why I personally must confess lots of admiration for Jane Goodall and Matthieu Ricard. It's that they have lives that are consistent with the ideas that they defend. And I think we need more such examples. There's a question here in the front. Second row. Thank you.
Thanks. Jonathan Balcom with the Humane Society Institute for Science and Policy in Washington, D.C. I wanted to return to a word that Olivier used at the end of the previous question, or 2 questions ago. That's the word growth. I'm glad to hear that word, and it's something that I find really troubling, that certainly living in the U.S., I don't know if it's the case here in Europe, but nobody seems to be discussing the issue of human population growth or human overpopulation. And it's sort of the elephant in the room, or perhaps the chimpanzee in the room. And I'm just curious to know what the speakers think in terms of if or when that issue is going to start to be in part of the dialogue, political dialogue, social dialogue of change. Because I can tell you that, according to the numbers, Americans have reduced their consumption of meat by about 10% in the last 10 years. Hypothetically, if the human population were to increase 10% during that same time, it would essentially nullify that progress that we've made on meat consumption. So it's an important issue. I think probably most people in this room recognize it's an important issue, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Well,
Jane.
I can start that off by saying that I have been including the problem of human population growth in just about every lecture for the last 20 years. I've worked with some of the organizations, the population, I can't remember their names now, but I know for a fact that World Wildlife and Conservation International and a couple of the other biggies, they had this big environmental meeting talking about protecting the environment with the major religions. And therefore, they couldn't talk about population growth. And therefore, it became a tradition that you mustn't mention it. But if you care about the future, if you care about what's happening now, you're completely right. It's the population growth that is so, along with poverty and unsustainable lifestyle, those 3 leading to climate change because of the way we behave. But with our program, I mentioned earlier that I realized we couldn't help the chimps or save the chimps unless we worked with the people. So our program to help the people, which was designed by them, it wasn't a bunch of arrogant white people going into the villages and telling them what to do. It was listening, and it was a team of Tanzanians listening, asking them, how could we help you? And gradually working on what they wanted, which was more food and better health and better education, we could introduce water projects and then family planning, women's reproductive health. And it was welcomed. We even have had men coming up and asking for vasectomies because they understand now that if they go on having the children they used to have, now that more of them are living and now that the resources are so depleted, that's the end of them. So there it's getting through to them. But you're right, there aren't enough people bringing this into the mainstream discussions, and it's tremendously important, and I'm really glad you mentioned it. Thank you.
Well, it's a hugely complex problem. First, if I want to say the position of the Buddhist, the Dalai Lama says, human life is eminently precious, but there's too many precious human life, big trouble. So it's clear, and he says, because there's always a sense of humor, more monks and nuns might solve the problem. So, of course, it probably won't. But, you know, I work on a Save the Mother and Child program in Tibet. The average is 6-7 children. We surveyed 600 mothers. 8 out of 10, mothers of all ages, had lost a child in their life. So they are nomads, they need kids. So if sometimes two die, In Bangladesh, six per couple, because they need them to take care when they are old. The moment you reduce child mortality, the natality rate goes down. So it's linked with so many issues: social inequalities, poverty, basic health. So in Bangladesh, when the BRAC and all those other programs went to provide mothers with a job, with some economic, it went significantly down over the last 20 years, from 6 to 3. So in a way, it's linked with so many factors. And another thing is, I remember a politician from Kenya saying, stop bashing us about this pollution problem, because we are not those who create the climate change and poverty in the world. If you think that US emit 200 times more CO2 than Zambia, so the question is not to bring Zambia to that level, but to bring down. So Zambia should go from one access, say, if you have the access to energy, from 1 to 10, but the 200 should come down to 30. Otherwise, you will never remedy the increase of population just to have enough people to take care of the land, to take care of the elderly. So it's so complex, but it's a huge problem, but it could possibly stabilize. And you have been working on the idea of providing food for 9 billion people in a more ecological way. So yes, of course, it's a problem. I mean, we have the most successful species. We have, when we were in the hunter-gatherers, we had tools that we could hold with our hands. Now the tools are power multiplied by millionfold with energy, electricity, atomic energy at the hands of groups and nations. So we have the power to destroy the whole thing. That's why we need care. That's why we need the heart with the intelligence. So if we do that, more social justice, there's a chance that we are more reasonable about, the proliferation of human beings.
It is, I have to say, very difficult in UN circles to discuss that issue. For many years in the UN, we worked with the Ehrlich equation, which was that the ecological footprint was a result of 3 factors: population growth, affluence, in other terms, levels of consumption, and technology, right? So the more the population grows, the more people consume, the more the ecological footprint is high, except that technologies may reduce that ecological footprint. And what happened historically in the UN is that countries from the South did not want population growth to be discussed because they feared they would be put in a position of being accused. And countries in the North did not want affluence to be discussed because they did not want the lifestyles of their societies to be questioned. And so what was left was technology, and green growth is exactly about that reductionist approach to sustainable development. So it's difficult to discuss, but I think it's also difficult to discuss because in the past some authoritarian solutions were given to population growth in some countries so that it has acquired a bad reputation to discuss this issue. But social protection made universal would be one key way to reduce the size of families, because many parents have many children because they want to be taken care of during their old age. And secondly, empowering and educating women, right? So that they have fewer children because they can say no, because they can decide how many to have, and because as a result, they can also take better care of the fewer children they shall have. So I think the empowerment of women is really key to this debate.
One of the most striking studies I ever read is like even a few months of education for a girl reduce mother and child mortality. That's So in Tibet and India and Nepal, we give a huge priority to women education. And Desmond Tutu and all this about early child marriage. I mean, this is a no-brainer that this should be forbidden, and that will dramatically reduce the population inflation.
But it's absolutely true that as women's education improves, family size drops. We've even seen that, in our own program, which hasn't been going that long, really. And so that's, but out of that equation you mentioned, I can't remember the issues that came up, you missed out poverty, and this crippling poverty, along with the, the unsustainable lifestyles of the rest of us. The two, you've got to bring them up.
Right.
We've talked about that several times tonight, but it's really important. It ties up with family size too.
Yeah.
Poor, you don't have health care, you expect your children are going to die. So you have more.
Yes, but the poverty must be eradicated. That is an absolute priority. But the average ecological footprint of a very poor family is significantly lower than that of an affluent family. So this is why the equation I mentioned sees affluence, growing affluence as a problem. And that goes back to your 6 planets if everyone was to live like the average US citizen, right?
But the poverty thing, there's another piece to mention on the poverty level, and that is that if you're out in a rural area and you're very, very poor, you cut down the forest to try and grow crops or to make charcoal. If you're in an urban area, you buy the cheapest food because you have to. Doesn't matter how many miles it's traveled, whether it involved child suffering, or, you buy it because you have to.
No, absolutely. So there probably is an optimal level of wealth that allows all basic needs to be satisfied and people to live comfortably, but without having to deplete the resources in the way you describe, but without overusing the resources on which we ultimately all depend. So contraction and convergence is really what we must remember
and also thinking of how we move forward. Matthieu, you must know about this far more than me, but the happiness index, so that as you get happier, if you come in as an immigrant and you have nothing, and gradually, you get a job, and then you get a wife, and then you get a child, your happiness index goes up. But then if you go on beyond having what you need, you get more, you're more successful in quotes, but your happiness index goes down. So there is a way that we can move forward.
Yeah, so just one last thing that comes to mind, because in Tibet I was so involved for many years. Now it stopped, but at some point there was hordes of medical Chinese teams sterilizing forcibly women, leaving them. After that they left. Some of them were okay, some of them died of infection. It was a complete trauma to all those nomadic communities. So about the Easterlin paradox, that after you get what you need, the happiness doesn't grow as your fortune double. I love this scientific study by Elizabeth Dunn that was published in Science, is money doesn't buy happiness unless given to others.
Very nice, certainly very nice sentence. If it were the concluding sentence, it would be perfect. Now, Yvan Beck is frowning upon us because we are, using too much of the time we have with the audience. There are also some questions pending. So, Yvan, do we want to interrupt now? What do you prefer?
I think knowing the grueling traveling agenda.
So let's have 2 last questions, and then we shall give the floor back to Yvan to conclude. Madam here at the
just 2 questions, please, because we have to leave after that. So just 2 questions.
Thanks for a very interesting lecture. I just wanted to make a comment about your discussion about people being selfish. I think that if we first need to define what selfishness is, because of course if we define selfishness as only caring about oneself, then you can say that the majority of the people are not selfish and they actually care about people. But I think the problem is that our capacity to care is very limited, and that a lot of people only care about people that are directly related to them. So that's their family or that's their very good friends. And there are limits to their compassion. So it's not either you're selfish or you're compassionate and you're a do-gooder. And I was wondering if you could comment on the ways we could extend our compassion or convince others to extend their compassion to people that initially seem less related to them. And I agree that to change others, you first have to change yourself and things like this, but I'm more asking about a practical way to actually achieve change and convince people to change their way of life.
Well, I only can come back to our Roots and Shoots program, which is one of the things that we try and build into the way the young people structure their programs. And you know, one of the words that I feel is tremendously important is respect. And we live in a world where there's a lot of argument and a lot of bad feeling, and you often hear, well, you have to be tolerant of these refugees coming in. They have a different culture. We have to tolerate it. And toleration, I think, is horrible. But respect is something very different. And respect and compassion, learning to care about other people, then automatically you should care about them more and be more compassionate towards them.
You know, about extending the circle. I mean, it's completely natural that we care for those for whom we are responsible, whose survival depends on us, like our children, elderlies, people who are dear to us, close to us, also people who treat us well. That's sort of given unless there is a complete, you know, misfire of our biology that we don't do that. Now, to extend the circle, it needs more a cognitive training of the mind. And that usually comes precisely with recognizing interdependence in a way. No, I don't wake up in the morning thinking, may I suffer the whole day and if possible my whole life. Basically, I think if I could not suffer, that would be so nice. If I could avoid suffering, I could find some happiness somewhere, even I don't see how, that would be so much better. We have this deep aspiration. Of course, we can be confused and do just the opposite, that what will bring us happiness. We can run toward the cause of suffering. That's confusion. But deep within, nobody wants willingly to suffer the whole life. So if we identify that and recognize that for what it is, you know, it's kind of, we could call it self-compassion or wishing good for yourself, not to want to suffer. Then if you realize the true interdependence, all sentient beings, even they are deluded, fundamentally would like not to suffer. So if we recognize that, in the same way that I value my aspiration not to suffer, why I should not consider that? And to the extent of my capacities, of course, we cannot just remedy the suffering of the whole world, so a single person, but to the extent of my capacity, why should I sort of stop here? I'm only going to take care of those. So as much as you can, if you have that vision that, yes, no sentient beings wants to suffer, basically, if you recognize that, then you value that, then as much as you can, you'll do something. So at least intellectually, you can extend the circle.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question. One last. Okay, Javier insists on, the microphone is there, so well done, sir.
Hello, I'm a student from Belgium, and I have been 8 months in Mexico for my exchange, and I have seen another culture. I have learned to watch the nature, and I have learned to take care about the people around myself. And what I want to share with you today is something that shocked me about my own culture. I have returned to Belgium recently, and on my way to come here with my mom, I met a group of people, of 5 people, and I just say hello with a smile. I walked, and they say to me something really, really bad about my mom. And my question is the following. In my place, obviously after that, I felt aggressivity and angriness, obviously. My question is the following, like, after a life of meditation about compassion, in my place, how would you react? How would you have reacted?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it's part of our topic, but anyway, once a story, because your story is a living experience, once the Buddha was insulted by someone who showered insult upon the Buddha. And the Buddha said, when someone wants to give you something and you don't accept the gift, to whom that gift belong? And the guy said, well, to the one who has the gift in his own hand. So I said, well, if I don't take your insults, then they still belong to you. So in a way, you did nothing wrong. So the insults belong to the person. It's very sad. It's very sorry. But, you know, why should it degrade you, basically, your aspiration for happiness, for compassion? So now, if you fall into the same trap and react in the same manner, then you will lose something. So anyway, benevolence may not change the person. If it does, great. If it doesn't, at least you keep your own dignity, your own inner peace. So it's always the best solution. Doesn't mean passivity. Doesn't mean you let people trample on your feet, but you don't resort to, say, malevolence, wishing to harm. That's never a solution. Anyway.
Well, I could add one thing there, and that is that had you reacted angrily, it might have turned into some kind of fight even. And the other thing is, why on earth did they have that reaction? That shows there's something really wrong with the society. And maybe you start thinking about that. Maybe you'll be a person who finds a way to do something about it later. Maybe that was an experience given to you now at this time in your life so that you might actually make a difference later on.
So it was a gift after all.
So it was a gift.